Okay, so I want to move on then to talk about Asian values and Asian attitudes, unless there are any compelling questions. Yeah?
Can you explain again why that analysis was, you said it was considered kind of like conservative bias?
Say again?
You mentioned that there was an analysis which was considered kind of like biased.
Well, it's the Amen and Verba argument that we need to temper participation.
Okay.
And some people feel that has a bias towards stability. Because if you temper participation, you're going to get the status quo. And the argument is that there are times in history when what you need is people coming out into the streets and mobilizing for change, whether it's a women's march, a workers' march, right to life march, whatever it might be, whatever people care about. Okay, now we come to one of my favorite subjects, which is the debate over Asian values, which is, one of the ways in which, or one of the regions in which democracy is seen to be kind of caught in a civilizational bind. According to this school, as articulated by a number of people, but certainly I'll show you in a minute, the late Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew has been one of the great advocates of this perspective. We are who we are. We are human beings who are, frankly, emotional, irrational, tribalistic. I interviewed this man. It's in the Asia chapter of The Spirit of Democracy, and this is how he thinks. If you don't have a heavy, strong hand, each ethnic group, each linguistic group is going to be at each other's throats, and society is going to spin apart. And what you really need is not, basically less than well-informed people making less than well-informed and less than wholly rational decisions. What you need is experts to decide things based on knowledge and merit. And so you get the notion of a meritocracy, and of course that has very deep roots in Confucian culture and tradition. If you don't have that, you'll have each ethnic group in a complex society like Singapore, which is divided along ethnic lines, or most societies in the world, organizing and voting on tribal lines. This also gave rise to my debate with him about the electoral system in Singapore, if you want to read about that. And this will lead to disorder, instability. Basically, human beings are selfish and tribalistic and need a strong hand in order to be governed well and have peace, stability, order, and prosperity. And people value, in particular Asians value, peace, order, stability, and prosperity more than they value freedom of speech, freedom of association, and the right to freely elect their leaders every few years. And you can read his quote here about the expansion of the right of the individual to misbehave as he pleases is at the expense of orderly society. In the East, he means East Asia. The main object is to have a well-ordered society so that everybody can have maximum enjoyment of, whatever freedoms are left after you get a well-ordered society. This freedom to be prosperous and not to live in fear or in ethnic conflict can only exist in an ordered state. And that is not a democratic state in his mind, although, he might not like to admit that Singapore is not a democracy, and not in a natural state, a Hobbesian world of contention and anarchy. It's a reasonable expression of his view. So now the question is this what Asians think and believe? Yeah? Oh, well, I think over time his views have shifted. The Singaporean government does not like to concede that it's not a democracy. Their argument is elections are fair. There's never been any contention that there's electoral fraud in Singapore. There's opposition that forms. There are legal opposition parties. They can contest and win and be represented in Parliament. And if they, if they're able to win a majority of seats in Parliament, they can form a government. So that's a democracy, they say. But if you look at levels of freedom of speech, freedom of association, and you look at the grotesque gerrymandering of the electoral system, which gives the People's Action Party regularly over 90% of the seats in Parliament, even when it only wins 60% of the vote, I mean, you see that it's something else. Yeah. Well, it's a really interesting argument. This argument that a country isn't ready for democracy, of course, that's been China's argument for Hong Kong as well. And what I'll say about Singapore, I've said repeatedly in writing about Hong Kong, that it's hard to argue when you get to a level of prosperity, education, sophistication that both Singapore and Hong Kong have, that the country isn't ready for democracy. I mean, when is it ever going to be ready for democracy, if you buy into that at all? And with respect to India, of course, we know that in contrast to many Western societies, the poor vote in greater numbers, not just in greater numbers, but a higher percentage of the poor in India vote than of the upper classes. And there is, there is this kind of class bias in attitudes toward democracy. I personally find it hard to see how India could have survived and thrived without being a democracy. I don't think it did. If you look at the one brief period when it wasn't a democracy, between 1975 and 77, during Indira Gandhi's emergency, it was a pretty grim time in India. Forced sterilizations, tremendous fear, deep, deep divisions. I don't think India would want to return to that. Anyway, so yeah.
Can you also explain why there's this belief that democracy is corrupt in the Asian Values School? I don't really understand that.
Well, the argument that democracy is corrupt in the Asian values literature comes from multiple dimensions. Number one is the philosophical dimension, that if the people are choosing their leaders through the grubby workings of populist electoral politics, in which they're distributing and offering benefits just to win votes, and maybe, the populist distribution of jobs in government, of course it's going to be more corrupt than the Confucian-style meritocratic system of government that an enlightened authoritarian regime. And then there's just the general view of human nature underlying that, which I've already spoken to. And then, of course, some Asian low-income emerging market democracies, from the Philippines to India, Korea in the early years before military rule, were corrupt. But then, authoritarian regimes at those levels of development are generally even more corrupt. So anyway, if you're going to make the argument, you got to look at all the evidence and not just select it out. Anyway, let's now see, yeah?
Sorry, kind of a follow-up question to the too soon to democratize question.
Okay.
So, sort of like, basically, like after a war, is that like a little different? Because I'm just kind of curious about like.
After war?
Sure, I'm just kind of curious about like kind of your experience with, like after the Iraq War.
Oh.
So it's like.
Well, look, if we're getting into the normative and philosophical debate here, I don't and have never argued that democracy is the right and necessary system of government for every country at every moment, or that democracy is achievable in every country at any conceivable moment. After war is a very difficult time, particularly when the state has been shattered, to have a democracy. And it is certainly the case, we could spend a whole course on this. If you take Frank Fukuyama's class, which I highly recommend, Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, you'll spend more time on it than I have to spend in this course, but we will spend a little time on it. That if you don't have a functioning state, you can't have a democracy. You can't have a democratic state without having a state. And defeat in war or total civil war collapses the state and then creates a very difficult foundation on which to reconstruct democracy. On the other hand, you can ask, would Iraq or Afghanistan be better if we just handed it over to a new Saddam Hussein and completely written off the effort to construct electoral, competitive, rule of law, and consensual political mechanisms? And I don't think that's the answer either. I think the answer is you got to have realistic expectations about what can be achieved in what time frame. And that actually sometimes a semi-democracy that has the aspiration, at least on the horizon, to become a fuller and more genuine democracy is going to get you further along even in a state-building process than just having a hard, kleptocratic, exploitative, tyrannical, authoritarian regime. Okay? Let's look at the evidence now from the fourth wave, the most recent wave for which we have data of the Asian Barometer, which was conducted between 2014 and 2016 in about 11 Asian countries. In different slides, we'll give you different combinations, but I'm mainly trying to look at the democracies of East and Southeast Asia, and in a few cases, usually I'll try and throw in Singapore as well when the slide has it. So the percent saying they're satisfied with democracy, varies over time. So we go from the first wave of the Asian Barometer, the very early 2000s, and then this is like 2006, 7, 2010, 2014, 15. And you can see it varies over time depending on how countries are doing, though some societies, in Japan, interestingly, it's improved, and in Korea as well. Philippines, it's kind of alternated back and forth. Taiwan, it's been pretty good. How much of a democracy do you think your country is? Is it a democracy? Now I'll tell you how the question is worded. Is it a full democracy, a democracy with minor problems, a democracy with major problems, or not a democracy at all? So this is a way of seeing how people are evaluating their democracy. And we add up the ones saying a full democracy or a democracy with minor problems. And again, you see people evaluate pretty highly in Taiwan and Korea the state of their democracy. Interestingly, in Thailand as well, even though it's been performing extremely poorly. A little more skeptical in Taiwan because they're very divided, and generally they're pretty optimistic, yeah?
I'm just curious, maybe this isn't the right time for it, but why Thailand has such high scores for both of these, given that there seems to be pretty strong alternating between more and less democracy?
This was a period before the military coup when the last survey was taken. And so you really have to look at this in terms of when the surveys were done. That would be very, very important. But it can also say something about the deferential nature of the political culture. In any case, it is, Thailand today is, first of all, it's a military regime, and second of all, I'd say it's a political system with a lot of problems. unfortunately. Much more than it should have, given its level of socioeconomic development, but that would open up a whole nother conversation about why that is, and that gets back to political polarization. All right, now we come to the preferential questions, the normative questions. One useful measure of democratic legitimacy. Would you say democracy is always preferable, or that sometimes an authoritarian regime can be preferable, or to someone like yourself, it doesn't matter? And this is the percent saying democracy is always preferable, waves 1, 2, 3, and the big bold number here on top, 4. And you can see in Japan, this measure of democratic legitimacy has been quite resilient. In Korea as well, it's actually improved from the early waves. In Taiwan, it's really become more equivocating. And I think political polarization in Taiwan is one reason why, but I'll show you other measures of democratic legitimacy that will look very different than this in Taiwan, and it's pretty good in the more middle-income Asian countries, Thailand, lower middle-income Indonesia, a little more equivocating in Mongolia and the Philippines. And this is simply the same slide, the same measure, the most recent year, 2014, 15, 16, okay? Now we say the system efficacy question, is democracy capable of solving the problems of our society? And actually this looks pretty good. People in these countries in East and Southeast Asia that have significant experience with democracy are not dismissive of it. They say generally at least 60 to 70, or in Indonesia, shockingly, almost 90% say, yes, democracy is capable of solving the problems of our society. Now that other measure I told you always winds up getting more support than the previous one about whether democracy is always preferable. This one is the Churchill hypothesis. Democracy may have its problems, but it is still the best form of government. Now look what happens in terms of, this is why I say the question matters. Remember, it was something like 47% in Taiwan for wave 4 for that question. Now it's 88% when you ask the question this way. And very high levels in all these East Asian democracies, or in one case, was a democracy and hopefully will be again in Thailand. So by this measure, strong kind of democratic ideals. If you average the three, democracy is capable of solving our problems, democracy is preferable, democracy may have its problems, but it's still the best form of government. And I think, averaging is useful. It's why it's useful methodologically to have different items and to create a scale or average of them so that you can control for kind of weirdness in terms of how people react to one particular question or what they're hearing when they hear that question or how it's translated. You see extremely high levels of democratic legitimacy in Japan and frankly now in Korea as well, 3/4 of the public. Still pretty strong in Taiwan, 2/3, in Mongolia, 2/3. And Indonesia, anybody work on Indonesia and have any thoughts about that? This is a country, this is fascinating. This is a country that had 3 decades of harsh and kleptocratic authoritarian military rule, after they killed 1 million people in the period during which the military came to power. And this is an astonishing, it's not like the system has been overwhelmingly successful in terms of development, order, protection of minority rights, but nevertheless, this level of support is very striking. Now, remember those authoritarian options I told you about? Democracy is not the only way to govern. Would you prefer getting rid of parliament and having strong leader decide things? What about having only one political party allowed to contest? Or would it be better to get rid of parliament and have the military rule? So this is how countries fall out in terms of their reaction to these three authoritarian options. And you can see now a sharp difference between the advanced industrial democracies, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the less developed ones, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia. Singapore is not a democracy, but they don't want these blatantly authoritarian options either. And we ask, sorry I didn't get this figure for Singapore, but we ask what percentage of the public rejects all three options. And here I just would alert you to the fact that one of the things we find is that people will say, you don't have just one group of people who say yes to every authoritarian option. There's a lot of people who say yes to one and no to the other two, and they're different ones. So having them reject all three is a much stronger test, and that's where you really begin to see the difference between the advanced industrial democracies of Asia and the others. I want you to keep that in mind as we drive toward an assessment. This is now a number of countries, including Burma, Myanmar in wave 4. That's the percent who reject all three forms of authoritarian rule, very low in Burma. And then this is how it's fallen out in the other countries in the other surveys. Now, I think that we can learn something by just asking what's been the trend in Taiwan over time in rejection of authoritarian regimes. And you see that over these three time periods, I'll tell you in a minute the fourth, there's been a steady decline in a willingness in Taiwan to turn to authoritarian options. In 2014, it was about the same level. It was 16% saying strong leader, and again about 9.4% saying only one political party, and the willingness to have the military is extremely tiny in Taiwan.